I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
Welcome everybody to Just Nowhere, and welcome to my desk here in the mountain village of Aula in Tuscany, Italy. Towards the end of 2019, I conducted an audio interview with Tessa Dick, one of the widows of Philip Kindred Dick, Philip K. Dick, 1928 to 1982, the author of sci-fi fantasy novels that dozens have been turned into blockbuster movies, like Blade Runner, 1982, and a remake in 2017, both with Harrison Ford, Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Minority Report with Tom Cruise, Scanner Darkly with Keanu Reeves, Next, right, with Nicolas Cage, Radio Free Albemuth, a more recent one, which was not a blockbuster, but I think better than any others. The other blockbusters I mentioned, starring this one, Radio Free Albemuth, starring Scott Wilson. If you don't know Scott Wilson's work, educate yourself. He's a wonderful actor, had a star role in The Ninth Configuration, a cult movie, starring Stacy Keach. Then most recently, I believe, was Man in the High Castle, Amazon series, a multi-season series, 3 seasons, ran from 2015 to 2019. Right, and the interview begins with my asking Tessa, right, to give us something of her biography, because most interviews with Tessa Dick just immediately begin concentrating on her late husband, right, and totally ignore her own person and her literary and intellectual achievements, right? And so that's how we start off. And she emphasizes that something real happened in 1974, these unusual so-called paranormal events, a term I don't like, but anyway, these unusual events in Philip K. Dick's life that have become famous because of the movies and the literature. Something real happened, though she explains that Philip K. Dick exaggerated and embellished the actual unusual events, right? And so what happened, right? Here's the movie version, the movie that Philip would tell people, right? He had a problem with his wisdom teeth, had to be extracted. He went home. He waited for some painkillers to arrive from a messenger from the pharmacy. Someone shows up. It's a young, beautiful, black-haired lady. She has the painkillers. She's wearing sign of the fish pendant or necklace. And he asks her, well, what's that mean? And then the sun reflects light off of this pendant, and he has divine revelation that begins, right? And so unusual powers or unusual experiences happen. For instance, he tells his wife, Tessa, our young infant son, he's suffering from a specific type of hernia, and unless we do an immediate intervention, right, he's going to die. So they rush him to the emergency room. All right, and it goes on from there. Well, what really happened? Well, according to Tessa, what happened was something unusual did happen. But first of all, it was not his wisdom teeth that were impacted. It was a problem with his molars, right? And so that was the issue. I suppose wisdom teeth needing to be removed is not as embarrassing as your molars decomposing, I suppose. He knew the meaning of the fish sign, right? This is Southern California, right? 1974. It was ubiquitous. You would see it all the time on bumper stickers. And in fact, Tessa and Philip had in their living room on their window a car bumper sticker of the sign of the fish, right? It was silver and black and reflective, right? And so that's where the light came from. It reflected off of their own Sign of the Fish bumper sticker, right, on their living room window. And so he knew what the meaning of it was. And as Tessa explained to me, after the interview recording, we continued speaking for a couple hours. Basically, he just wanted to stare at her cleavage. So he asked her, what the meaning of this fish was, right? But anyway, and as far as the hernia goes, he did approach Tessa in what she called a trance-like state. That's what it appeared to be. And in an odd voice, he told her, yes, our son has such and such specific type of hernia, and it's very dangerous, life-threatening. But they didn't rush to the emergency room. At their convenience, they took the infant in to the doctor. He examined, said, well, in fact, yes, that is the type of hernia he has. And so they scheduled a surgery for several months afterwards. It had to be delayed for various reasons that you'll hear about. So something unusual did happen, but, very embellished in Philip's retellings and in, for instance, the latest rendition, a dramatization of this in the Radio Free Albemuth, right? We also hear from Tessa that Philip suffered from bipolar disorder. He was not schizophrenic. And he definitely knew the difference between reality and hallucination. Also, the role of drugs has been exaggerated, right? As far as explaining his literary production goes, right? So he did LSD twice, but this was not illegal. It was obtained from a university. And even the speed that he did in order to stay up and, increase his literary activity, right? This was not off the street, right? This was obtained for good or ill from, various of his doctors. Also, another point that I would like to make is that it seems to me that some academics who are working on Philip K. Dick and his literary works have an elitist attitude. They like to emphasize, well, Philip, he didn't know anything except through his encyclopedia set, his Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, this is certainly not true. Tessa explained to me that he was an avid reader, he read widely in his younger days, like when he was going to university. It didn't last long, but he read the works of Plato, of course, in translation, but he read the works of Plato. He read German philosophers. He read mystical literature. He was psychology. He was widely read. But by the time of the exegesis, which was basically the last 10 years of his life, he was writing trying to figure out how to explain these unusual experiences of 1974. By that time, he was increasingly suffering from agoraphobia, which prohibited him from basically leaving the home and going down to the local library and reading books for himself. So he was then dependent for purposes of reference, right, on his home set of the Encyclopedia Britannica for those years when he was writing the exegesis. We also hear from Tessa, we learn that the Beatles song, Paperback Writer, actually refers to Philip K. Dick. This she learned in this story she tells involving, it starts off with the 1971 infamous home break-in where someone broke into Philip's home and stole some of his manuscripts and tax records, I believe. But this gets into the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency or Administration, right? Relating to John Lennon and Timothy Leary. It's a fascinating story, a part of American history from the 1970s, from that counterculture, if you will. And so it's a fascinating interview wherein she also briefly laments how Philip got basically $1 million in 1982 for selling rights from his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, right, which was turned into the Blade Runner movie, which came out in 1982, the year he died. And he really wasn't able to enjoy this newfound success that he had. Well, in any case, we'll get to the audio interview. Just before that, now I'll say that this this episode of Just Nowhere will be anticipating another presentation I'll give, a separate presentation where I'll talk about the exegesis, Philip K. Dick's exegesis, informed by portions of the interview which will not be included today, and my own musings, right, that I discussed, right, with Tessa about the exegesis. So with that said, let's get to the audio interview. Thank you.
I went to Fullerton College, which is a 2-year community college, studying life sciences and pre-medicine because I wanted to be a veterinarian. But then I did an internship with a veterinarian and found out that it was not for me. So I took my 2-year degree in foreign language with emphasis on German. But then I went on to Chapman College before they sold out and became a university. They were focused on teaching and not so much money and prestige. Mm-hmm. And I was studying communications. I did film and TV production and slideshows and live theater. This was back in the dark ages. Nothing was digital. We were begging people to let us borrow 8mm cameras so we could do our film project. Right. We couldn't afford a 16mm. And then when I finished that, of course, Phil had passed away. And I couldn't get a good job. They all told me to my face, "Oh, you'll be absent too much because your son will get sick and you'll stay home." He was still young then. So I went back to school, did my master's in English literature, and then I still couldn't get a decent job. My son was a teenager and very wild. A good boy, but a handful. So I started teaching at Chapman University, and I spent 12 years teaching English and communications, but I really could not deal with the politics in academia. The students were wonderful, but the hierarchy among the academics was just cutthroat, horrible. And I just can't see becoming like them, being a vicious, backbiting, hypocrite. So I eventually just quit teaching and started writing full-time. And as a freelance author, I wasn't really making a living. So when Amazon made it possible to self-publish, I went for it. I have books on Amazon and on Kindle. I usually delay the Kindle edition until the paperback has been out for a while. I used Kindle to put out a preview edition of my current project, just a short introduction to it. The working title is The X in Exegesis. I have a werewolf novel for juveniles, late teens, early 20s, called The Bad Moon Rising, like the song. I wanted to quote the lyrics, but I can't get permission. And I have a kind of a memoir, not really a biography of myself, called My Life on the Edge of Reality, just to let people know that Phil was not the only one who had weird experiences. And it was rather thin, and I didn't want to add any more to it. So at the end, I put in a long story, I guess a novelette that I wrote based on some dreams that I had. Those were the dreams that led me to come live in the mountains. And I have 3 books about Phil. I get more money from Amazon than Smashwords or Barnes and Noble. I know a lot of people don't like Amazon, but it works for me. And they actually pay a better royalty than any traditional publisher. Now, the first book about Phil was Philip K. Dick, Remembering Firebright, which covers the experiences of 1974, in which he had visions. And I don't believe everything he said, but that radio did keep on playing after it was unplugged. I just heard popular music. He heard it telling him to die. I listened to him tell the same story to different people, and it didn't matter whether the story was important or just mundane. It wouldn't be the same every time. I was there when things happened, so I knew when he was making it up. Something very real did happen to him, but he exaggerated, embellished, and made stuff up. The important thing for Phil was that he was harassed and driven out of town, and that he was still suffering the trauma a couple years later when he heard a voice that he identified as God telling him that he was a good person, he was protected. The rest is kind of a bunch of fluff. So in my second book about Phil, Conversations with Philip K. Dick, I just described some of the conversations he had. He didn't go out much, but people would come to visit, and he'd sometimes offer long, complicated lectures, and other times just tell jokes. So I tried to recreate some of the things he said and the people around him. Well, and then he encountered a French doctoral student who was so disappointed. He had this thesis he was working on for his doctorate, all about what Phil's work was about. And Phil told him, no, that isn't it at all. It's really about this other thing. And the poor student got so angry that his thesis was ruined that he left. Some American students and professors were adopting the postmodern stance, the death of the author.
Yes.
And they would tell Phil what his work was about, and Phil would say, no, this is what I really meant. And they'd say, that doesn't matter. What you intended is doesn't matter. Getting past the death of the author, it's really over 100 years old, but it caught on in the 70s and 80s. I guess they think that the French are like little demigods and they have to follow their lead.
With Philip K. Dick, do you think that a lot of scholars really exaggerate the role of drugs as far as his creative powers?
Definitely.
First of all, isn't it true that he took LSD only twice? My impression is that that his friend Ray Nelson actually got it from the university.
That's right. It was the Sandoz pharmaceutical from UCLA.
And the amphetamines, probably 99% of those were prescribed by doctors. These were not street drugs.
That's right. Phil would smoke marijuana if you offered it to him, but he didn't go looking for it. He didn't buy it, but if you passed him a joint, he would take a hit. He was self-medicating, mainly for his depression. I think he was bipolar. They called it manic depressive then. He would get really high and then really low, and he was not on any drugs. Well, he was on medication for his blood pressure, which was very high and dangerous. But other than that, He wouldn't even take an aspirin until he had his oral surgery in 74, and they gave him Vicodin. Or no, I'm sorry, it was Percodan.
Percodan.
They're all pretty much the same thing. Vicodin, Percodan, oxycodone. They're just substitutes for codeine. Phil knew when he was having a vision and when he was in reality. Schizophrenics don't seem to know that. It's like I tell people, because this is what Phil used to say, I might be crazy, but I am not stupid. Yeah, he could be paranoid. He would see patterns that in the past had led to disaster, and so he would foresee a disaster because it was the same pattern happening again.
Sure.
And he was always certain that I would leave him. And he told everyone that I left him, but the truth is he left me. He hired a moving van and took all the furniture and then told his friends that I left him. And they believed him. Apparently, even now, there are people claiming that he took methadone or methamphetamine by the handful. He would have died with the first handful with his blood pressure. Apparently, some friends talked him into going to, or maybe I don't know, they somehow got him into a psychiatric hospital. And he told them that he was taking 1,000 meth tabs a week. So it's in his medical records. That's horse pucky. But they take it as God's honest truth, you know. It's gospel. He was eating meth tabs by the handful. Even his friend Tim Powers believed it.
Sure.
Phil had these chewable vitamins, and he told Tim they were meth, and Tim believed it. It started with Dangerous Visions. Phil's story, Faith of Our Fathers, was in that anthology. And Harlan Ellison, who put it together, wrote to introduce the story that Phil wrote it while on LSD. Well, if you've ever had LSD, you can't write anything. That started all the rumors about Phil being burned out on drugs. And they thought he had not written anything for several years. But the truth is that he had written Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, half of Deus Erie, and another novel that someone stole the manuscript, so it never got published. Just hadn't published in a few years. He had written. Well, my third book about Phil is a little more academic. It's Blade Runner creator Philip K. Dick. I like the two Blade Runner movies, but I really tore apart the new one for all its flaws. Neither one really gets the point of what Phil had in mind with his novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The 1982 Blade Runner comes close in Rutger Hauer's speech at the end, Tears in the Rain. Yeah, and Rutger Hauer wrote most of that himself. It's a shame he's passed away. I really would have loved to meet him. Phil did give that impression that he relied on the encyclopedia, because when he was writing his exegesis, he frequently quoted from the Encyclopedia Britannica. But he also read actual philosophy when he was younger. He majored in philosophy at UC Berkeley before he was forced to drop out because he failed ROTC, the military officer training.
Right.
Well, that was how he got a deferment from being drafted to fight in Korea. But it turned out that his high blood pressure kept him out anyway.
Right.
That he had read actual works of Plato in English translation. Right. He read a great deal of psychology, too. He really liked Harry Stack Sullivan. He was a psychologist or psychiatrist. I mean, a doctor, actually, but he was actually schizophrenic himself. And he liked Jung well enough, especially because Jung wrote about flying saucers. And he didn't like Freud. But even Freud, said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. He read a great deal when he was younger, and he still had some of those books. But unfortunately, when he, his agoraphobia, he couldn't get out much. It kept him from going to the library or the bookstore and getting the actual books. So he relied on the encyclopedia and by the series of history books by Will and Ariel Durant. He got it for free when he joined the Book of the Month Club. He knew a great deal, but when looking for a reference, he didn't have the books he'd read before, so he'd slot in something from the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia isn't, the information is correct, it just isn't considered good on an academic level. And of course, we can't afford the academic periodicals, they're outrageously high priced. Ordinarily don't pay the authors, and sometimes the authors have to pay them, and it's publish or perish. So I've been contributing to kind of fringe but sort of academic periodicals. Mine is Emanations. You can find it online or on Amazon. I even have an article in a French anthology. Of course, they translated it. I studied French, but I had a tutor and barely got a B. And when I was in high school, we had classes in Latin and Greek. It was an accelerated program. Oh, Mom put me in this school for gifted children. But really, if you could afford the tuition, they didn't care if your IQ wasn't that high. But, well, we didn't have the money, but Mom could drive a school bus. Yeah.
Let's fast forward. Can you tell me what is 2374 and what happened? What actually happened?
Okay. First, there's been a great deal of confusion because, of course, in Europe and England, they note the dates backwards. Of course, they say that we Americans do it backwards. It was actually March the 2nd is what Phil meant originally, so that he would remember the date when he received the infamous Xerox letter. But it really began in February when he had oral surgery. And he said that he had wisdom teeth pulled, but I know where the teeth were missing, and they were in the front. They were molars, but they were not wisdom teeth. He had bitten into, I think it was just a hot dog bun, something very soft, and his tooth shattered. And the surgeon had to take out that tooth and the one next to it because they were so badly infected. See, I hadn't quite gotten my driver's license yet. I had a learner's permit, so I could have driven with him in the car, but we decided to take a taxi cab. So we had when the surgery was over, we had the doctor call his prescriptions to a pharmacy that would deliver them to our house. There were antibiotics for the infection and then the Percodan for pain. And I don't think I've ever had Percodan. I've had Vicodin. And because I had a broken leg. And it still hurt. I just didn't care. And that's exactly what Phil said about the Percodan. It still hurt, but he didn't care. And people who've never experienced that think it's a joke or something, but it's real. You still know that your broken leg hurts, but it's okay. And let's see, so we got home by taxi cab, and Phil went to lie down. And I was in the kitchen when the lady from the pharmacy came to the door. And I was reading in the exegesis that he said she had black hair. She wasn't blonde. She did have a fish sign necklace that she was wearing, but that isn't what, it didn't shoot a pink beam of light at Phil's head and make him have visions. After Phil took the pills and I gave the lady a check to pay for them, he turned And on our window, our living room window, was a sticker that Phil had bought a few weeks earlier, and it was a fish sign. It was a bumper sticker for your car, but we taped it in the window. And that sticker was silver and black. A black background with a silver border and silver fish sign. And the sunlight caught it just right so that Phil was briefly blinded, just momentarily. And then he went in the bathroom to get water and take his pills. So he was seeing pink images. They were phosphine activity reacting to the bright light. And of course, they were in the shape of a rectangle, just like the sticker. So he knew exactly what a fish sign was. He didn't need her to tell him. He just had to think of something to say. Then he went and lay down again and watched the phosphine activity on the white wall of our bedroom. It was not, the light wasn't on, but there was some dim light from the windows. The curtains blocked most of the light. That's how it began in February. I think it might have been the 18th, but I found an old manuscript that I have to go over, one that I wrote closer to the time when the events happened. I found all my rejection letters. Oh, we love this book, but we can't sell it.
Isn't there's a little bit of misinformation about the hernia story in some of those documentaries?
Oh, Phil made that up too.
What actually happened?
The pink light happened in February. It was September when Phil, he took a lot of naps. He got up from his nap, walked out to the living room and said, "Our son has an inguinal hernia, make an appointment with the doctor." And he went back to bed. I mean, he seemed to be in some kind of a trance. He didn't seem to be himself. So I called the doctor and made an appointment, and our son had an inguinal hernia. So he referred us to a specialist. And the specialist said, yes, he has a hernia, but we can't do surgery. He's too young. The soonest we can do it is January. And this was September. We were told not to allow the baby to cry because then the hernia could strangulate and kill him. So we had the most spoiled baby you ever saw. Every time he cried, one of us would grab him and hold him and see what he needed. At a certain point, parents will let the baby cry himself to sleep so they can sleep too. Not with this baby. So there was no rush to the emergency room or any of that.
But what basis did he have to suspect a hernia?
People point out that Phil had a hernia once, but his was not a birth defect. Got it as an adult while he was playing tennis. And as far as I know, he never had it corrected. I think, considering that he changed the diapers exactly once, and that was, I'm pretty sure that was after the surgery. I don't think he had any way of knowing. I should have suspected because one of my older brothers had a hernia, and he was 9 years old when he had the surgery. But, Rick was a spoiled baby because he was cute. Nobody suspected a hernia until, he was 9 years old and there was something wrong with his plumbing, so they had the doctor look at him. They call it an undescended testicle. It had something to do with a hernia. But I didn't think of it. I just thought our baby fussed an awful lot. We called him Fussy. But, the real events didn't make as good a story.
Those two experiences, two events, the pink light and the awareness of the hernia, are these the two main events that set off the exegesis?
I think the main thing was that he saw or heard figures from history that he had read about talking to him, like Erasmus, and still have a blank. He wrote The New Atlantis.
Not Francis Bacon.
Yeah. And some of the early church fathers, like Augustine, Origen. I strongly suspect that the initial events were electronic in nature. First, the vacant apartment next door got filled with all kinds of electronic equipment. And I thought that the landlord must be spying on his wife because it had a working telephone. And when I picked it up, because I'm curious,
Sure.
I heard his wife talking to someone on the phone miles away at her house. But when our phone wasn't working properly, the telephone repairman told us it was because there was an illegal tap on our phone. Our phone was tapped. And he took it down because it wasn't the police doing it. There was no warrant. It was illegal. And I strongly suspect that there were projections of sounds and even images, like an early form of the hologram. They did exist then, hologram. And you know, by the time we hear of a new technology, it's usually 20 years old. But I go back to before I met Phil in November of 71, November 17th. 1971, his house was invaded and torn apart while no one was home because an acquaintance had lured Phil and his girlfriend Stephanie away from the house. And then Phil's car broke down and the mechanic told him somebody had sabotaged it. So by the time he got home in a taxi, the driver would not take him to his door. He let them out on the corner and they had to walk home from there. But he said the taxi driver was afraid to drive down his street. And that had never happened before. Well, the house was torn apart. Somebody was looking for In some versions, Phil says they took everything of value. In other versions, he says, oh, they left cash and a valuable wristwatch sitting out in plain sight. So, go figure. But the consistent thing is they took his bank records, his tax records, and the manuscripts for the novels he was writing. One did not survive, but Phil, being paranoid, had sent a carbon copy of Blow My Tears, the Policeman Said, to his divorce lawyer. And Deus Irae was about half finished when he sent it to his co-author, Roger Zelazny. So those two novels survived. The third one did not. They took both copies. It wasn't finished anyway, but it had been The Owl in Daylight, and it was at the end of his life when Phil decided to try again to write it. Didn't live long enough. But I've put things together, and I think it was Phil, you know, he was really paranoid about President Nixon. And he had some good reasons for it. Nixon created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Here's Phil with dangerous visions. Harlan Ellison says he wrote it on acid. And then Phil signs a petition in Ramparts magazine promising not to pay any income taxes till we get out of Vietnam. But what I never put together, because I was kind of out of the loop as a kid. I wasn't sheltered, I was imprisoned. Anyway, I just wasn't aware of things like the bed-ins with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. I heard about them, but I wasn't interested. Well, at their second bed-in in Montreal, a young journalist named Paul Williams was there. They were recording Give Peace a Chance, protesting the war in Vietnam. Well, Paul Williams had met Philip K. Dick. He had his phone number, and he said, hey, he had given copies of the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch to John Lennon and Dr. Timothy Leary. So he says, let's call Phil and talk to him. And he did. And Larry got on the phone and told Phil that he was a big fan of his work. And they thought that the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch was about LSD. And in a way it was, but Phil had written it before he ever tried LSD.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, yeah, he was a bit of a precog, I think. He could see into the future a little. Anyway, according to Phil, he also told him, or John Lennon said, that the Beatles song Paperback Writer was about him, about Philip K. Dick. So that would be June 1st of 69. Early in 1970, Leary is sent to prison on drug charges. October of 1970, Leary escapes from a prison. It's really in Central California, but not that far from where Phil was living in San Rafael. His life falling apart. First he had the pancreatitis, and then Nancy left him in late 69. So early 71, Phil's still kind of at loose ends. He's got his brother-in-law still living with him. He's much younger than Nancy even. So there's all kinds of young people hanging around the house. And Michael is using and possibly dealing drugs. And there's Phil, who's had a phone call. Now, they wouldn't have had Phil's phone tapped, but they certainly would have had a tap on John Lennon's phone. And Larry has escaped from prison, and they can't find him. They know he had help. So they go through all these phone records to find out who has had contact with him. And Phil's name pops up. And Phil signed the petition in Ramparts. Harlan Ellison says Phil does LSD. And Dr. Timothy Leary, of course, is a proponent of LSD for treating mental illness and just for having fun. Leary ended up as a minor celebrity touring Europe, and Phil ended up with his house torn apart. And the sheriff telling him, "We don't want your kind around here." Well, so he was already scheduled to be guest of honor at a science fiction convention in Vancouver, British Columbia, not the one in Washington State. So Phil flies to Canada, rents an apartment, plans to stay. But he ends up coming back down to Fullerton after a so-called suicide attempt. When Phil, you'll hear him in some of the YouTube clips. He says the memory came back entire and so forth. He remembered everything. He never tells you what he remembered, but he told me. He was walking on the street in Vancouver at night, and two men in black suits grabbed him and shoved him into the back of a limousine, drugged him, hypnotized him, told him to kill himself, and then he woke up sitting on the floor of his apartment with an empty pill bottle and an empty water glass. So he called for help. He didn't remember taking the pills, but he obviously had. That was his so-called suicide attempt. That's not the FBI. He knew consciously that he didn't have much time left.
Right.
He used to talk about how authors would have their books made into movies and there'd be millions of dollars, but they wouldn't be alive. They'd die before they could enjoy it, and that's what happened to him with Blade Runner. He had over $1 million, but he didn't live to enjoy it. Phil really had problems with his therapist, but yeah, I'm sure he did him some good too.
Sure.
I just was ticked off that Barry Spatz got paid to go to all these conferences as an expert on Philip K. Dick. One of the first things you learn when you learn to do counseling is not to believe anything the client tells you. He swallowed it all. He believed everything Phil told him. I have to quibble. He'll claim that he came up with a word or a phrase in Greek or Latin that he couldn't possibly know. Well, with his love for classical music, he knew a great deal of Latin from the masses and so forth.
Exactly.
He had the librettos. listen to the album and look at the libretto.
Sure.
And as far as Greek goes, he had an interlinear Greek English New Testament. And he did crib a few words out of it without really understanding them.
In one of the Philip K. Dick documentaries, Ray Nelson talks about one of the times that Philip used LSD, he was speaking Latin.
At that time, the early 60s or mid 60s, Phil would not have known enough Latin to say what he was saying. Basically, I don't want to die. He thought he was a gladiator going into the ring. And I don't think he could have held a conversation in Latin the way Ray describes it.
Well,
So I think there's a little of both. He knew some Latin from, say, Missa Solemnis, but there was too much of the conversational tone to say that was the only source of it. But yeah, he could quote things from the masses and oratorios and so forth. I think perhaps at least the movies made from Phil's work opened the door to more movies that touch on the paranormal and don't end up, in the low budget genre.
The Radio Free Albemuth, I give that an A plus.
Oh, I love that
Even though it's a
movie.
low budget film, for me it catches that feel of the Philip K. Dick books better than Blade Runner.
John and Elizabeth, I forgot the last names, they really got it. They understood what Phil was getting at. Like A Scanner Darkly was literally faithful to the book, but they didn't get it. It isn't just that drugs are bad. It's that the war on drugs is bad, and they just didn't get that.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.